Hello everyone, this is Dr. Sutherland. We are looking today at rational emotive behavior theory, REBT, and this is Albert Ellis's theory. So we'll look at the foundational assumptions and then we will take a look at applying it with our case, Mrs. C, and how REBT would conceptualize her case. Once again, make sure you have your blank case conceptualization analysis tree. You can download that for REBT from CAMS. So here are the key terms that you want to be familiar with. You'll find that these key terms are a mix of terms relevant to REBT and also to Aaron Beck's cognitive theory. So just make sure you're aware because all of that came in the same chapter, so all the key terms were together in your text. So just make sure that you're aware which ones go with which theory. So here are the basic premises of REBT's model of pathology. The primary things to note, of course, are that psychopathology occurs when irrational beliefs are self-defeating and cause emotional and behavioral consequences. A distinction to be sure that you understand is that everyone in some way, shape, or form engages in irrational thinking. The difference between someone who develops a pathology and someone who does not rests in the frequency and intensity of the emotional dysregulation that is influenced by the level of irrational thinking. And so the emotional dysregulations that we are, of course, talking about will be things like depression, anxiety, guilt, hostility. All of these, according to Albert Ellis, are unhealthy and unnecessary, and they are illogical. The belief is that emotional disturbances can be avoided if people base their lives on logic and empiricism, and that is what improves healthy functioning, not reliance on the supernatural or the mystical, for example. All right, so let's take a look at the ABCs of REBT. All right, so A, of course, is going to be your activating event or your stimulus. B is going to be the different kinds of beliefs or cognitions that come as a result of the activating event. And then C are the consequences. So we have emotional consequences, what we feel, and then behavioral consequences, what we do. So the types of beliefs that will influence consequences, there are three types. The first one that we need to make sure we understand are expectations, and these will be expectations of ourselves, others, the world, and generally they are too high or too low, and as a result of irrational thinking, because they're too high or too low, we'll get the emotional or behavioral consequences that come in terms of irrational emotions as well. And then we're looking at self-efficacy as another type of belief or cognition. And these will be beliefs about whether we can succeed or not, or what we think we can or can't accomplish. And the third would be self-concept, what you think of yourself, and some descriptors are here. Children absorb opinions of their value based on how people important to them treat them. And so the basic premise there is that we act like we think we are. And so when any event occurs, we choose to focus on certain things about the event and not others. So our attention can either go to expectations, our attention can either go to self-efficacy, our attention can either go to self-concept. And so we see events, A, the activating event, through colored glasses, and the colored glasses will be expectations, self-efficacy, or self-concept. All right, so in terms of our therapeutic process of change, what are we after? We're after modifying beliefs in order to impact the emotional or behavioral consequences. So here are the first three of the things that we are after in the therapeutic process of change. Increasing awareness of consequences that are driven by irrational beliefs. And we're teaching clients to identify irrational beliefs about activating events and the link to consequences. And we can think about consequences just in terms of that is what we see when folks come into our office. Those will be the presenting symptoms, the problematic behaviors or emotions. One thing to note as well about REBT is that even though there is the conceptualization within the theory that beliefs can be tied to those that are developed in childhood uh, in terms of how we're treated by the people that care for us or the people that we love, the theoretical approach in terms of the therapy does not delve into the past or uh, does not believe that change will come about by dealing in the past. Primarily, we are looking at the present only. And here are the remaining two aspects of the therapeutic process of change in terms of what we're after. Helping our clients understand that irrational beliefs are a defense mechanism and what they're aimed at controlling or managing, which is conflict. All that we have talked about in terms of what we're always trying to manage is intrapersonal, individual, social, and beyond conflict to fulfillment. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later on. And then we're teaching our clients to learn to dispute irrational beliefs with logic and with empirical information, which is a big deal in rational emotive behavior therapy. So these are things that you need to make sure that you review again in the text, but this boils down what you most definitely need to know. So just go ahead and make that review. Allow this to shape your review as well. Oh, we missed one. Replacing uh, the irrational beliefs with rational beliefs. All right, and the development of an effective new philosophy of life, and that is as important as well. All right, I think that's it. All right, and this is just an overview of all of the pieces of the process: A, B, C, D, and E. And so just be sure that you're aware that all of these pieces are encompassed in uh, Albert Ellis's theory, which will be different from Aaron Beck's theory. All right, so let's take a look at Mrs. C and how she is conceptualized within REBT. Again, just make sure that you've downloaded your case conceptualization analysis tree from CAMS, and you can follow along and make notes in that form as we talk through Mrs. C. So your basic ABC, your activating event, your irrational belief, and your emotional or behavioral consequence. So for Mrs. C, our activating event was the case of pinworms contracted by her daughter. And I would say also that there might have been multiple events contributing to the activating event, because remember, she was pregnant at the time, there was the Asian flu running through the house, there were several things happening to create one very intense and large activating event. And the consequence, of course, was her morbid dread of pinworms, the compulsive need to wash because of that, her compulsive avoidance of intimacy, and linked to, of course, her compulsive avoidance of unclean things. Sex was unclean, and then also that dirty underwear and that connection to that bodily area as well. So we're trying to figure out then what would be the beliefs that would contribute to her emotional and behavioral consequences, according to REBT. So if we recall from the text, irrational beliefs or dysfunctional attitudes take the form of rigid or dogmatic thinking, what Ellis calls masturbatory thinking. And those are your musts and your shoulds and your ought tos and your have tos and your got tos. And those are discussed as rigid thinking patterns. And then Ellis also talks about catastrophizing. And these are unrealistic and overgeneralized attributions. So, for example, if I don't have X, then this awful thing Y is going to happen, or I can't bear for Y to happen, and it will be the worst thing to ever happen. I'm so stupid and worthless, I'll never recover, then I'll never be happy. And that is just catastrophic type thinking. And so irrational beliefs and dysfunctional attitudes fall into those general categories. So if we look at Mrs. C, what would be her masturbatory thinking patterns? Where would they fall? We could say that she does do some of the musts and the shoulds and the oughts and the have tos. For example, her thinking pattern could be, I must behave perfectly in order to be worthy as a human being. And so that is going to be tied to her perfectionistic beliefs. And remember, we see the evidence of perfectionism for her in, for example, naming her children in perfect order alphabetically, for example. Also, one of her musts could be, I must do everything I can to prevent this whole pinworm thing from happening again. And we can see that she is kind of in a battle to help that not happen with the constant washing, for example. We can say that she has some shoulds. I should have been able to stop the illness from happening in terms of the pinworms, and I should be able to stop it from happening again. And so we know that that is the case because her compulsions continued even when the illnesses were over. And so we can potentially say that there was a should pattern of thinking that she should be able to stop recontamination from occurring. We can see ought tos. I ought to be taking care of my kids and my husband instead of doing all this incessant washing. And so we see some guilt coming on. And that is an example of some of the dysfunctional emotions, or one of them, that can arise from masturbatory thinking. And then a have to is I have to be clean. Historically, there was a need to be clean even before the development of the compulsion. I remember her job involved employment from washing and sterilizing instruments in her place of employment. So we can see that that compulsion was there and working its way through different aspects of her life. Anyway, all right. And then in terms of catastrophizing and overgeneralization, we can say potentially that the Asian flu and pinworms are terrible and awful events, and that's the end of the world. That could be her catastrophizing. She's at fault for allowing it to occur. Could be another way that she's catastrophizing. And then other dysfunctional or distorted or irrational thoughts could be things like, I'm a careless mother for letting this happen, or a perfect mother would never have allowed this to happen to her children. I can't protect my children, or I did not protect my children, or I deserve to be condemned for allowing this type of thing to happen because I neglected my children. Now I'm doing all of this compulsive washing to prevent recontamination, and in her thinking, irrationally, she could say, but look, I'm neglecting my kids' others' needs in the process of doing all this compulsive washing to prevent recontamination. And so she can guilt herself into thinking that she's a terrible mother that way as well. She can guilt herself around doing all this compulsive washing and in the process neglecting her husband's needs. And so she's a terrible wife and So she deserves to be condemned for allowing these types of things to happen. And so the result, unfortunately, is a vicious cycle of self-condemnation. And in that cycle, she could be thinking, I'm just never going to improve. She's been to a lot of therapy, and so that could also feed a cycle of self-condemnation because she hasn't improved. Um, Thinking about herself in terms of not being worth anything. Um, Remember, her husband and doctors had been thinking about putting her in a psychiatric hospital. So that would feed self-condemnation as well. Thoughts of being a failure and letting her husband and children down. All of those types of things are distorted and irrational thinking patterns um, that are that constitute the beliefs that will drive her emotional and behavioral consequences. So if we look to just to think about how her upbringing might have influenced some of this, um, because there is a parental contribution to irrational beliefs and dysfunctional attitudes. We'll recall that her mother had a compulsion or multiple compulsions that suggested perfectionism must be pursued and that it is in fact possible. For example, her mother was compulsive about cleanliness and being free from disease. And being free of sexual desires and looking at sex as a dirty act. So Mrs. C's irrational thinking was pretty much present throughout her life, but the pathology was triggered by the stressful activating events, which was the series of illnesses, which pushed her into catastrophizing behaviors and rigid masturbatory thinking. All right, so that's Mrs. C in terms of how REBT would conceptualize her. All right, so if you think I said some of that too quickly, the great thing about this is that you can rewind and listen again to help clarify. So please feel free to do that if you need to. Okay, and so the therapeutic process of change. So how do we modify beliefs? And there are three areas of focus here. Consciousness raising is the first one. And the consciousness raising process in REBT really is rooted in more so philosophical discussion. Even though Ellis talks a lot about empiricism, this part of the therapeutic process is more philosophical. So he'll engage refutation, for example, pointing out contradictions between multiple beliefs or between beliefs and actions. So questions like, what evidence do you have that yada yada yada, or where is it written that yada yada yada, or I can't stand to be criticized, it drives me crazy, might be a statement that a client would make. But the refutation would encompass discussion around being uncomfortable, but that you won't die, and then demonstrating in session by doing whatever that thing is that they can't stand, and then assessing the outcome and matching that outcome against what they thought would happen. And so that all is part of consciousness raising for REBT. And then we have contingency management in terms of another how we modify beliefs. So one example of that is here, confrontation of the consequences that are anticipated that are generated by the irrational thinking. And here's a great example. If a person has a fear of being laughed at, then arrange for a group to laugh at the client and then reevaluate the consequences. Evaluate what happened versus what they imagined would happen. And then contingency contracting is also a form of contingency management, and that is, for example, if you have a client that fails to do homework, which is a big part of REBT, then you find something aversive to the client, and you use that. So, for example, I think in the text it talked about someone who might have been a Republican or an independent and didn't like Democrats, let's just say. And so the client would have to give the therapist $100. And every time the client does not do homework, the therapist would send $25 to uh, the DNC, which would be aversive to the client who says that he's a Democrat hater, for example. And that's an example of contingency management. And then counter conditioning. And note that there's a strong behavioral piece here that we're talking about as part of this theory, and sometimes this is considered more primary than even the cognitive piece, which is your rational emotive part of it. So just note that that behavioral piece is very strong in this particular theory, as we're seeing. So counter conditioning, also known as reciprocal inhibition, and engaging in the healthy behaviors counter conditions the unhealthy behaviors. So an example of something like that would be, let's say that you have a dog who, when presented with a certain stimulus, becomes agitated, starts to yelp a little bit, things like that, every time that particular stimulus comes. Counter conditioning could be the form of soothing the dog with petting and stroking at the time that the stimulus comes, every time it comes. And so we are warding off a unwanted response with a wanted response. And that's basically counter conditioning. We're warding off an unwanted response in order to generate a wanted response. And the wanted response from that dog would be to be calm. And being calm can be brought about with stroking and petting and soft words. And so that would occur whenever the stimulus is there, and the wanted behavior will recondition or counter condition the unwanted behavior. I want to say that at some point in class someone asked me whether or not this was the same as stimulus control. It is not the same as stimulus control. Stimulus control is different because it presumes or is based on the premise that there is a certain behavior that comes when in one setting where a stimulus is, but that behavior does not come when you're in a different setting. And so stimulus control is controlling the stimulus, the setting itself that triggers the behavior. And so an example of that, I believe I gave in class, centered on a little boy maybe who exhibited aggression when around a certain peer group engaged in a certain activity, but did not do that when, or didn't have aggression when in other settings. And so attempting to control the stimulus would be engaging in different activities other than the one with the friends. So he could, instead of from 3 o'clock to 5 o'clock after school, going to hang out with those friends and engaging in the activities that brought about aggression for him, he could instead choose to play the drums at home because it would help him be a better drummer in his church band, let's just say. And so from 3 to 5, he changes the stimulus. And so the behaviors do not come about because he's changed the stimulus. That's the difference between stimulus control and counter conditioning. So just make sure that you read more on that in your text and just make sure that you understand the difference. And in terms of therapeutic content, what specifically we are changing, of course, once again, we work our way through intrapersonal conflicts, interpersonal conflicts, individual social conflicts, and beyond conflict to fulfillment. And so, of course, we see anxiety pieces that come from irrational thinking. Um, and the text does talk about defenses that we should be aware of as attached to this theory: projection and repression and rationalization. So please make sure you're aware of those. Self-esteem is also defined in this theory as the conflict between our irrational desires and it's the self-esteem is the conflict between irrational desire to prove our worth as human beings and the reality that we really can't ever achieve that through our own self-defined ratings of ourselves. And the reason for that is because our beliefs and emotions, they kind of swing between good and bad. Sometimes controllably, we control them, but other times uncontrollably. And so if our emotions swing back and forth or our beliefs swing back and forth, then our self-defined rating changes all the time. Um, and so the goal is unconditional self-acceptance. So we accept who we are, warts and all, and pretty much give up on the search for self-esteem because it is an unrealistic concept, because it can never be achieved. So that is how he thinks about self-esteem. And then, of course, um, responsibility for our own issues without projection, without repression, without the shoulds and the oughts and the musts. And then in terms of interpersonal conflicts, he talks very specifically in this theory about intimacy and sexuality and the irrationalities connected with that. He talks about love and intimacy as being great to have but not necessary for existence. And if we believe that we must have it or we ought to have it or we should have it, therein lies the irrational thinking that leads to anxiety and depression and codependence. Another example is sex. It may be more enjoyable within an intimate relationship, but it's not necessary for love and sex to go together. And that sex can just be for fun. And so our dysfunction comes when we think that we should have it or we must have it or we ought to have love with sex. And when we don't, then the emotional and behavioral consequences come in terms of anxiety, depression, things like that. And a lot of that comes too because socially, sometimes there is a prohibition against that idea, and that also is involved at times in generating the anxiety and depression. The text talks further about communication, hostility, and control, so go back and review those and have a good sense of them. But just make sure that you have an understanding of an example of interpersonal conflict, such as what I've given you here with intimacy and sexuality. In terms of individual social conflicts, Ellis talks about this in the frame of the reality of injustices and frustrations that are part of living in society. And the idea that really we can never transcend those types of injustices, and that the desire to transcend them instead of adjusting is at the source of neurosis, anxiety, depression, aggression, and that this is just very emotion driven. So his thought is that we ought to adjust to this understanding that we cannot transcend the reality of injustice in the world, for example, but we are better off using logic and empiricism to fight injustice wherever possible. And then one example around beyond conflict to fulfillment that we can talk about is Ellis's belief that there really is no such thing as meaning of life. He believes that meaning is only found in maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain. So having a better life uh, free from current symptoms, um, and where we are powerful enough to remove new symptoms as they come is how we maximize pleasure and minimize pain. And that's the only meaning to life. In terms of the ideal individual, that would be a scientist, someone who is committed to the rational life. So, um, I guess we all should be scientists. All right, here are some of the differences between Beck's cognitive theory and Ellis's REBT. We will deal with cognitive therapy in another audio, but here are some differences, and just make sure that you are clear on what the differences are. All right, if you have questions around this, once again, add your questions to the questions bank online, and we will discuss those clarifications that you need when we meet online in the next few days. Alrighty, email me if you have any questions as well, just in terms of general questions, but specifics again around any of these, add it to your to the questions bank. Alrighty, talk to you soon.